Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Michael and I'm joined again by my brother Bradley. We are excited to take a few minutes right now to talk through the recent interview that we had with Pastor Joel Webbon. Again, why are we doing these interviews and these follow-ups? Well, our goal is to work to try and understand what makes for a good and godly society, and what has made Christendom great. Also, what flaws did Christendom have? But we believe there's great heritage that at least the two of us will speak for ourselves. We're very unaware of and have kind of ignored. And so we are excited to talk to people who know about the heritage of Christian thinking about politics, about the church, about government, about economics, about art, all of these things. And after we interview people, we like to take a few minutes to just kind of talk through and even be honest about maybe where we have a hard time with what was said or don't understand what was said. And you'll hear some of that in today's follow-up discussion between the two of us, because the conversation with Joel, while fascinating and very interesting and very profound, is also fairly new material for Bradley and for myself. And so we're going to kind of talk about a couple of things that stood out to us from the first part of our of the interview with him, and then we'll come back later on and talk about the second part of the interview with him. So, Bradley, we were talking before this, and I think that a good place for us to start is just to be honest about the fact that as Joel was talking about, some of the postmillennial ideas, and while it is a view of the end times, actually, I think that people have a little bit harder time with it because of the implications that view of the end times has for the here and now, specifically in how much Christians should or should not be trying to kind of advance God's principles into the society in which they live. Now, the postmillennials would say we're doing it through the gospel. But as we talk to him, I think we can just kind of acknowledge at the beginning that it's kind of some new material for us. And we have, still major question marks as we listened through and talked about what Joel was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think starting from kind of the back end of that first part of the interview, but one of the biggest hurdles for me, and he acknowledged that was one of the biggest hurdles for himself in getting to the postmill view, was the idea that in the postmillennial view holds that Christ will save the whole earth, and that once Christendom has fully achieved God's purpose, for it, literally the whole earth will be saved. And in holding,
he would say the vast majority, I think.
Yes, and in holding, but the premise being in holding that more people will be in heaven than in hell when yes. Christ returns.
In fact, Charles Spurgeon taught that very thing.
Yeah, and I, I'm not sure if it's just. It is just from my upbringing, what I learned from about eschatology and the verses that were quoted about the end times, and that's a hard hurdle for me. And specifically, he brought it up a little bit, but the verse in Matthew 7, I believe, it's Matthew 7,
13 and 14.
7, 13, and 14 that talks about. Well, I'll just read it.
Why don't you guys read that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Matthew 7:13 says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that lead to destruction. And there are many who enter through it." Okay, so there's going to be many in the post-mill view, but here's the second part. "For the gate is narrow and the way is constricted that leads to life." And if it ended there, that would be fine. I could follow along with his argument. But then it says, "And there are few who find it." So I still have a hard time and I would like to keep studying where the post-mill view gets its interpretation of that, how they, because he talked about, or they might rationalize it or they might interpret it as it's a narrow path, meaning the knowledge base is limited. Like you can only hold to a certain set of principles and beliefs to get you to Christ. So the gate is the belief system, but then it does say there are few who find it. So if there are few who find it, how do you hold to more in heaven in the end than in hell? So that's definitely a hurdle for me to think through and think about. I think both of us would agree that there is an optimism and a mission focus in the postmill view that is very enticing and very appealing. It calls men to mission, and I think that's something that makes men. I think that's something that men long for. There's high risk and high reward, but it's an appealing perspective because it does, it is optimistic, but that's one hurdle for me for sure that he talked about a little bit. That as you were listening, you might have felt the same kind of hesitation to fully buy into that.
Yeah. It's so interesting that he said in that interview that, and maybe even part two now, but he said, really the difference between post-mill and pre-mill is just the belief about whether or not the gospel can be effective enough to do these things. But I agree with you. That verse, Matthew 7:14, is hard because it makes a numbers contrast. Many find the wide gate that leads to destruction, and few find the narrow gate that leads to life. I've talked with some people who hold the post-mill, and they explain that passage by saying that the many or the gate being wide and the gate being narrow is not necessarily like water flow, but just difficulty. It's very easy to find hell. It's very hard to find heaven. And only the grace of God can bring someone to find heaven. But like you accurately pointed out, the two verses create a comparison or a contrast, not just of flow and amount, but also of numbers, right? And so that's definitely something that it's a passage I want to keep studying a little bit. Kind of pull out the implications, and maybe even by next week we'll have found something in our second follow-up. So
sure. So that's one area that we wanted to touch on at least. I think another area that we can touch on because it's a big distinguishing factor for the post-mill belief, for the Reformed belief, and it's not just when we talk about post-mill, this is not a new eschatology. It's rich in heritage, like Michael said in the intro. There's a rich Reformed heritage in it. There's deep, rich thinkers of years past that have given this thought. But in our current kind of American evangelical church, we kind of hold to three methods of interpreting the Bible, and Joel touched on a fourth one that a traditional American evangelical right now would view as too much inference into the past. I don't know if you want to expound on, so like into the text. So, the post-mill guys quote verses that leave you kind of going, well, there's a big jump between what that verse says and what you're trying to draw from it. And I think it comes down to that fourth way of interpreting it. So you have a better sense of that.
I think that hesitancy that you're identifying there specifically seems to be where they'll say something out of an Old Testament passage, and then they'll say that passage is talking about the reign of Christ, the physical, current earthly reign of Christ, where that passage is talking about the kingdom that God is unrolling now. And you look at it and you think, I don't know that the passage is absolutely saying that, right? And our hesitation. So when we read, authors who are post-mill, I think, man, that's so interesting. I don't know if I would have come to that conclusion, right? And so Joel talked about the ways that we interpret the Bible. And we actually have kind of methods for interpreting the Bible. We certainly, don't open the Bible and just say, oh, I think it means this. I mean, the worst Bible study in the world is the one where people open the Bible and they go around one at a time and they say, I think it means this. And they'll say, oh, interesting. And the next person says, I think it means this. Oh, interesting. And then they go, and everyone has their own, oh, I think it means this. And no, that's not studying the Bible, right? There are actual methods and ways that we study the Bible. And so the three that I've always been familiar with, and Joel alluded to them, are the literal, historical, and grammatical interpretations of the Bible. So we take the Bible in its literal or most natural sense. We take it in its historical context as it was understood, first of all, by the original readers or hearers. And then we study the grammar, right? We take a grammatical approach to studying the Bible. And yet, I think the thing that Joel was talking about was that, for instance, when you look in the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, who I think was most likely Paul, spends a lot of time developing this defense that Jesus is superior to Abraham, right? Jesus cannot be inferior to anyone. He cannot be inferior to the patriarchs. He cannot be inferior to the prophets. He cannot be inferior to the kings, or else he is not the Son of God. And so the writer of Hebrews is trying to point out that Jesus is superior to Abraham. And to do that, he pulls out this part of Genesis that talks about Abraham's interaction with Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was a priest king of Salem. And Abraham tithes of his spoils of war to Melchizedek. Okay, and it's not that long of a story. And yet the author of Hebrews finds a bedrock argument there that the fact that Abraham tithes to Melchizedek, and then he says Jesus is in the line of the priests of Melchizedek, and therefore Abraham was, in a sense, he was inferior to this king of Salem, Melchizedek, and that proves that because Melchizedek was a type of Christ, that Christ is superior to Abraham. Now, that's the sort of thing that you would read and you would think, is that really what that passage is saying? And not the disagreement here, but the difference in perspective is that I think that a lot of evangelicals, and Joel pointed this out, would say, if we're going to make that kind of leap, the only people who are allowed to make that kind of leap are the apostles who were being divinely inspired to make that connection. Whereas Joel said that the reformers looked at the apostles making those sorts of connections to patterns of Christ in the Old Testament and said it's not that the apostles were divinely inspired and only they can do it. They were divinely inspired, but rather they left a pattern that we can carefully and studiously do the same thing when we look in the Old Testament. And so you get passages like Isaiah 65, which Joel talked about, which talk about the new heavens and the earth. And, you get Reformed writers talking about the new heavens and the earth where the people will live much longer. And if you die at 100, it's because God cursed you or because it was a tragedy, right? And this kind of rampant prosperity in the future. And Matthew Henry says this. He says, the event alone can determine what is meant. So he says, we're not 100% sure what it's talking about, but then he says this, but it is plain that Christianity, if universal, would so do away violence and evil as to greatly lengthen life. In those happy days, all God's people shall enjoy the fruit of their labors, nor will children then be the trouble of their parents or suffer trouble themselves. The evil dispositions of sinners shall be completely mortified. All shall live in harmony. Thus the church on earth shall be full of happiness, like heaven. This prophecy assures the servants of Christ that the time approaches wherein they shall be blessed with the undisturbed enjoyment of all that is needful for their happiness. as workers together with God, let us attend his ordinances and obey his commands. And so Matthew Henry looks at that and he says, I can find in there a type of Christ's kingdom, right? That passage is talking about Christ's kingdom now on earth. And I think that's what Joel mentioned, the willingness of the Reformed theologians to follow the pattern of the apostles rather than cut off that sort of biblical interpretation and leave it only for the apostles.
Yeah, not to get too technical here, but he referred to that method of interpreting the Bible as a couple different things: analogical, right? Typological, and what was the third one he mentioned? Christological. And I find it really interesting. One, because you see average life expectancies going up, now compared to centuries ago. So there is that, and then you see speakers. You mentioned a interview that you had seen of Jordan Peterson.
Recently.
That was recently that acknowledged that the world generally is in a much better place than people acknowledge. The starvation is a rarity, except for in tyrannical oppressive governments. So hunger is down across the world, and he acknowledged that if we put our mind to it, his assessment is that in 15 years we could be rid of basically most human strife. So even more secular thinkers acknowledge that with a little bit of effort, we can improve life to a point where there's little strife, and you see the rich people trying to come up with all kinds of ways to extend their life, right? They want. Now, I've always viewed that as just a vain pursuit of their own glory, like a fear either overt or not of death. But you do see technologies that are being explored and developed, so that is something to consider there. But the second point I wanted to make on that in the method of interpretation is kind of ties into the interview we just did that'll be released in a week or two, talking about literature and story. When we read stories, there can be more meaning than just the initial, what the initial writer meant, what the initial time reading it, what you gleaned from the initial time reading it. So it strikes me as reasonable to think that as we learn on our own over time, on our own, but also in society and in culture, that we could pick new meaning, not heretical meaning, but we could see new interpretation, like that verse in Isaiah, over time. So it seems to fit in with the way that we read stories and the significance of stories, to be able to go and say, yeah, we can apply this here. And I don't know exactly how a traditional evangelical pastor would respond to that. They would probably think I'm crazy for saying that. Mom would think, absolutely not. The Bible's literal, and you can only interpret it literally. And I would probably say I am trying to interpret literally, just in a context then and a context now. I don't know.
Well, I mean, okay, so not because you took us here. I will say you are in a little bit of dangerous territory there, because there is a tendency in progressive Christianity for the last 100 years, maybe even more than that, to say, well, we can just kind of read into a text, whatever suits our current context. And the Reformed position and the evangelical position, all of them start with a grammatical, historical, literal interpretation of the Bible, right? And so it is very important to know what the author meant. I mean, we have this conversation. It's not an inspired document, but we have this conversation about the Constitution all the time, and we get really upset when people are like, "No, we can make new rights," and we're like, "No, the Constitution was written It said certain things, and we're not going to change those. So,
Yeah.
however, all of the Old Testament was veiled to some degree. You know, the prophets, as they were writing things out, they were longing to understand. They were looking intently into what they were writing, trying to understand it. And it was only once Christ came. You know, the road to Emmaus is a great example of this. He went and he explained how all the law and the prophets pointed to him. So I don't think you're off in the sense that the coming of Christ definitely shaped the direction and the understanding of what the purpose of the Old Testament was. So, you know, even Jesus said, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," and he unveiled the actual deeper meanings of the law rather than the superficial ones. So that's part of what makes this whole process complicated. Is it does require great study and great wisdom, and that's not a cop-out. But actually, I would say it's more of a reason to read the great writers and thinkers of the past, because these are the sorts of things that, you know, develop over ages. You know, great doctrines develop over lifetimes and generations.
Yeah, I don't know if this is an apt illustration or not, but you could consider the coming of Christ as a removal of the fog of war. So the landscape has always been there, you know, of the Old Testament, but Christ removes the fog of war so we can see it more clearly in its bigger picture, in its bigger context, kind of all the pieces playing together at the same time. Whereas before they were limited to what I mean. I only thought of that because the use of the word veil, kind of this. They got a glimpse, you know, they got their present glimpse of it, and could interpret that, but had a longing to know, you know, a deeper breadth of it. So, all right. Any other thoughts on that? I think we've kind of touched that. Again, none of what we're saying is gospel by any means. We're just kind of thinking out loud and trying to sort through the issues. And
I will say this: as I have gone back and I've read commentaries by, you know, John Gill and Matthew Henry and some of the Puritans, I find that they were really unabashedly talking from what seems like a postmillennial view. Like that one that I just read from Matthew Henry, he said, you know, the church is going to do this. It's going to bring almost universal conversion. And it's interesting to me that they were very confident. They're still very well-respected Bible commentators.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And again, you know, as we were growing up, as I was growing up, you know, I knew the gist of church history, you know, like I kind of knew the timelines and the basics of church history, but the actual like reading of the Reformers and the reading of their commentaries and the acknowledgement that they had already thought through all this stuff. I mean, it's kind of self-obvious or self-evident that obviously they thought through this stuff, but we don't often build on that. We don't go. We try and reinvent the wheel. We try and reinterpret it all on our own and and trust the most current commentaries, and because they're a little easier to read or they're more like our language. I don't know. Contemporary language. But there's rich history there, and I desire to dig deeper into that. I think there's value in that. It's daunting. Again, not to plug our episode a couple weeks from now, but there are ways that you can dig into some of that richness of the past, and we hope to do that. So,
yeah.
Anything else we want to talk about? I had Joel made a comment about the basically Christendom defeating. He said something along the lines of like, right now in our current time, the job of the church is to defeat the idea of Christendom, or sorry, not to defeat the idea of Christendom, is to defeat the idea of secularism. And then once we've defeated that secularism, then there'll be a new spirit of the age, a new something that attacks Christianity, and it'll be, our posterity that defeats that. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit with the little bit of time we have left here, because I do feel like there's just kind of a natural sense that the premillennialist has of just impending doom, right? So like everything's just going to hell in a handbasket, and everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I was right to start with. But there's a certain truth in that, and you see it in people's lives, especially as they get, like, take an addict, for example. As the addict gets further down the road, that addict kind of has to hit rock bottom more often than not, has to hit rock bottom before they can be restored, if they're going to be restored. And so if you think about the secular state of the world now compared to an addict, I feel like we are in that plunge, and no amount of, it feels or it seems that no amount of truth being spoken to that can stop the trajectory of that rock hitting the bottom of the ocean. I mean, it's already maximum sinking depths. Like, that thing's not going to all of a sudden float back up. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on kind of how you square the optimism of postmillennialism with just the simple reality that things do decay over time, and things do get worse, and then they can be built back better. But I don't know.
Really, you just went there.
I did just go there with a Biden quote, I guess.
I have two thoughts. First of all, in Ephesians 6, when it talks about we are taking every thought captive, we're destroying speculations and everything that sets itself up against the knowledge of Christ. It is very interesting and actually very hopeful to me to consider that God, in his omniscience, knows all the enemies, all the spirit of the age, worldly philosophies, false doctrines, antichrists, and things that set themselves up against him. And it is interesting and hopeful to me to think about the fact that the church through the gospel will over time just knock down those false ideas, those enemies of God. And that makes sense of that Ephesians 6 passage. And then, the application of that to the individual is, he says, therefore, put on the full armor of God, right? Like, gird up your loins, get ready for battle, because the church is out destroying the enemies. And in that verse, the enemies are I think it's very important to remember, especially with the abortion debate going on right now. Rarely in Scripture are the individuals the enemies, right? It's the philosophies, the ideas, the ideologies, and maybe the people behind those who really are controlling and pushing those things. But rarely is it the actual individual. They are enemies of Christ, but that does not make them our enemy. Our enemy that we're waging war against is a spiritual battle. But we fight on earth, even though we use things like prayer and the Bible, which is the sword of the Spirit. We are here. We are not only spirit, we're spirit and flesh. And so somehow our physical effort of using the sword of the Spirit and the armor of God and prayer accomplishes this knocking over of the enemies of God. The second thing I want to say, though, Bradley, and I didn't think about this until you kind of rephrased the question just now. The story of the gospel and of God and of really the way God works. He picks the foolish things to shame the wise. He picks the weak things to defeat the strong. And Christ won. He conquered through death. And I don't think it's at all at odds with the idea that God will defeat his enemies through the church by saying he will do that sometimes through allowing the fruits of a hostile idea, an ungodly idea. He will allow the fruits of that ungodly philosophy to destroy a people or an individual life. And in that destruction, out of there, rebuilds the truth. I think that is very in keeping with how God seems to work throughout all of Scripture.
That's really interesting. As you're saying that, I've got to wrap up here to go pick up Dad at the airport. I'm sure our viewers care tons about that. But as you're saying that, another prequel to what's to come for us. I was listening to Eric Kahn's podcast, Hard Men. He's going to be on the program in the near future. And he was talking with Sean McGowan about a book called Psalms That Curse. And there's a specific term for psalms that plead the destruction of enemies. It's a technical term. An
imprecatory psalm.
That's the one, the imprecatory psalms. And they were very careful to make the point that the psalmists don't pray imprecatory psalms. And if you hold to the fact that Christians are still called to imprecatory psalms, it is not called to a specific person. It is called to an idea. So it is not wishing death and destruction upon a specific person, Joe Biden or whatever, but on the idea that he is driving. So they talk about that. It's a really good podcast. Again, that's Eric Kahn on Hardman podcast. But everything you were saying, it was very much in keeping with that whole conversation they were having. So that's good. But I think that's where we're going to have to leave this one. Until next time.
All right. Thanks for all of you listening. Just a quick reminder, next interview will be part 2 of our interview with Joel Webbon, and then we will follow that up with a part 2 of our kind of reflection on what Joel is saying about postmillennialism. So we hope you'll check back with us. And as always, if you have questions or comments, please contact us via our YouTube page or through our website, which is rebuildpodcast.com. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, sounds good. See you guys.